what's your sense of how we can better individualize, that we can apply science from group cohort-based studies?
That's an excellent question. And my approach is usually, and this is something I repeat when I present to coaches and when I talk to athletes, is try to put as much evidence base into your training program, because that will give you more opportunities to succeed and get things right more often than you get them wrong.
Well, a very warm welcome, Inigo. How are you, my friend? It's been a long time since we last spoke.
I'm doing all right, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I think the last time we saw each other was at INSEP in Paris for a conference, and it's been nearly a decade now.
It has, yeah, too long. You've no doubt been continuing to do some brilliant work, and just thinking about connecting with you made me remember just some of the great conversations that we've had between sessions, conferences. Often when I'm stood up talking on stage, I'd see you at the back, not prepared to sit down. You'd be sort of jostling about, thinking, pondering, and it would inspire me to try and give my best on stage when I was presenting too. Listen, and I'm pretty sure most people know who you are, but I think actually for my benefit as much as anything, just give me an overview of your background, your experiences, and because there's so much rich experiences that you've covered over the years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a sports physiologist, and I have been focusing on high performance sport for a very long time now, nearly 3 decades or over 3 decades. I have a couple of PhDs, one in biology of muscular exercise in France, and another one in physical education and sports science in the Basque Country. And in elite sports, I've worked extensively in professional cycling, elite swimming, also in professional football. And because I'm also a level 3 swimming coach and triathlon coach, I've been fortunate to work with very high level triathletes. I've been coaching Olympic and Ironman distance triathletes for about 13 years. I finished that after Rio. I haven't been coaching directly anyone ever since, but I've always kept involved in the high performance environment. For example, in the lead up to Tokyo, I was the head of sports science for Spanish aquatics. And at the moment, ever since October 2021, I am an advisor for the Japan High Performance Sports Center. So that's basically the background.
Yeah, and so you're spending a bit of time over there, or is it long distance?
We do most of the work online, but I do go to Japan at least once a year. Yes, I was there in March for a couple of weeks.
That's where I saw you last. It was China. It was China.
Oh, that's right, with
Yeah,
rowing.
yeah.
Yes, we met in China after
And
INSEP.
that's it. And I remember saying to you, what do you reckon is the ratio for translation? And you said, yeah, it's about the same, sort of you speak for a minute, they speak for a minute. So, ratio wise for slides. And my poor translator, honestly, I got all the way through my slides and I had like an hour and a half left. And I had to pad. I had to pad for another hour and a half.
Yeah,
That
it
was
was at the National Rowing Center, huh?
yeah, I
Yeah,
think it was.
yeah.
Yeah, great.
David Bishop was also there, if I'm correct. And yeah, I think David Bishop was there, and
Might have been. Yeah,
probably Paul Thompson as well.
yeah, okay. Inigo, before we just go any further, could you just drag your zip down? It's dragging on your microphone. Is that all right?
Oh, all the way down. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, there we go. Yes, so there we go. That was our last connection. I remember seeing you over there. And so you didn't mention you were in Australia for a period of time, and so you've been globetrotting around
Uh, yes, I
for
was.
whoever has you. Yeah.
Yeah, I was a senior physiologist at the Australian Institute of Sport, but it's been 20 years now. It was 2003 and 2004. I still have collaborations with them, and I recently did an online lecture for the Australian system. But yeah, it's been 20 years since I was actually one of the senior physiologists there.
Yeah. What a team to have been part of. Um, and your experience of working across sports, that sense of either coming in as a consultant, being on the payroll for teams. What have been your observations and some of the defining characteristics of good and bad teams that you've worked in?
hmm Well, I've done both. I've been on payroll with professional cycling and professional football as well, and also at the Australian Institute of Sport. And I have worked as a freelance or as my own company also for elite swimming and also in professional cycling. Um, I think the main advantage of doing it as a freelance is that you manage your own time and you don't have to justify what you do besides your tasks for the team or for the institution you are working for. So if you are on payroll, it's more difficult to justify doing other things besides what is described in your contract. Whereas when you are doing it as a freelance, well, as long as you can fulfill everything that is described in your job description or in your contract, the rest of the time is your time, so you can do whatever you want outside of that. And it, I don't mean that I have had a lot of trouble in that sense, because all the institutions I have been on payroll with were pretty open for me to, do some other lecturing or do some other counseling with, as long as it wasn't a direct conflict of interest with whoever was paying the bills. But mainly, I would say that freedom to do other things would be the main advantage of working for yourself or working as a freelance.
Mm. And and in terms of the culture, the tone, the team working, when you kind of go into an environment, um, what are the things that you sort of look for and spot? You think, okay, this is a place that's going places. This is happening here.
Hmm.
Versus there's limited scope or potential in this team.
Yeah, personal connections. I think whoever I'm talking to, and the level of passion of that person and the level of security about the path that the person has is very meaningful to me. I received a lot of offers to collaborate with different teams, different institutions, different organisms, and sometimes if the person you are talking to doesn't feel confident or doesn't have a clear idea of what they want, it's like, this is not going anywhere. Some other times, your the person you are discussing with, you can feel that they know what they want, they know why they are contacting you, and they know what they want from you. And that gives me the perception that yes, I should be there because I know this is going somewhere. And that to me is very important. And anybody can write a very nice project and something that sounds fantastic and that looks excellent on paper, but I think it's the person communicate in that project, and the people involved in the project that usually convince me on whether it's a go ahead or not. So I think it's always about people rather than institutions or rather than projects on paper, because anybody can copy paste some beautiful project from somebody else and present it as their own. But if you don't see some high quality leadership and some people who are convinced about what they want and about where they want to go, my feeling is usually that this is not going to happen. So it's usually a no-go.
I can imagine just that sense of, and I can certainly relate to this, just that if somebody's come to you and said, this is where I'd love you to add value, this is the bit that I think that you can add a special insight or a philosophy or critical thinking, or contrast that with those sorts of conversations when someone says, this is the priority, and this is the priority, and there's another thing, and there's another thing, and there's another thing, and it just becomes a mess rather than honed in on terms of what you can contribute. Is that what
Yeah.
you're sort of referring to there?
Yes, and sometimes when the project sounds really good and then it changes along the way and you don't see the new direction or the reason for that change, I prefer to step aside and do something else. And this morning I had an interview in which a project like this was presented, a solid project with very clear ideas of where they want to go, how they want to do it, and what they want from me. It was a 40-minute conversation, and by halfway through the conversation, I had already said yes. I can't tell you more about it yet, but I'm committed to a new project because of how convincing it was, and the passion of the person that I was talking to, and the nice interaction, and the feeling that this guy is like me. This guy wants things done, and he's a doer, not just a talker. So in 20 minutes, I had already said, "Yeah, you can count on me." Whereas
Yeah.
when you see that yeah, they kind of know what they want, but they don't know how to get there, and they don't really know what they contact you just because they've heard about you or they know your name and they would like to be able to say that they cooperate with you. In that case, I'm usually not convinced.
Yeah. Okay. And does a lot of your work or the contacts come through your network, people who already know you? Is that the majority, or is it cold inquiries? Just out of interest, really.
Yeah, sometimes it's inquiries from people who know about my work, so they know about my scientific publications on the one hand and my books, but on the other hand, they know about my practical work with elite sports. So they contact me out of the blue. But it's true that some other times the connection comes from recommendations from people I have previously worked with, or from people who know me personally. So this interview I had this morning came through their recommendation of a common friend between the people who wanted my input and somebody else who is already collaborating with them and with whom I have had some extensive interaction in the past. And that common friend said, "Oh, for this project that you have, you absolutely need to contact Inigo." And I think they
Yeah.
were right, because I,
Yeah.
I, I
Great.
really
Sounds
like the
exciting.
project, and I thought, yeah, this is something exciting, and this is something I want to be involved in.
I think that just that statement that you made there around personal connections and the people that are there, that if you have a network and that people are referring, there's a strength to that, that ultimately they're coming to you because of a one or two steps away from you. I think that really matters, and certainly as a consultant myself, choosing the people that you get to work with is a healthy thing for your mind. Sometimes, the bank balance might wobble a bit, but because you've got to choose
Mhm.
carefully, but you got to choose your values carefully, haven't you?
In the past, Steve, I have given up jobs and positions just because I did not enjoy the environment, or I did not enjoy working with some of the people in that environment, and I prefer to risk my bank balance, as you said, and go and find something else than be unhappy. So to me, enjoying what I do and enjoying who I do it with is very, very important. And I'm fortunate that I don't have, I don't have a lot of mouths to feed, and I don't have too many bills to pay, and I don't have uh, fancy interests that are very expensive. So, sometimes I can afford to say, I'm out of here, even if I don't have anything else lined up. And I've done that in the past because I prefer to enjoy what I do and be passionate about it than to do something just because of the money and going through the motions. It's not something I'm interested in.
Mm. I think there's a strange situation in work as a whole, whether it's in business, whether it's in sport, that people have a loyalty to that, or a hex from the paycheck. Um, they can't necessarily see beyond it, when actually that's not adding health and wealth in different areas other than the bank balance. Choosing the environment, choosing the tone,
Mm.
choosing the culture, the energy or the passion that you've mentioned. That's so important for how it feels to get up in the morning. The difference between getting up and thinking, "Oh no, I've got to do that," versus, "Oh, I get to do this today." That's a big
When
factor.
you choose that second option, you get the feeling that you've never worked. You know? I remember talking
Yeah.
to a very good friend of mine and a great physiologist, John Hooley, and both him and I, we agreed that we get the feeling that we've never worked in our lives. It's like, oh, what do people what do people do for a living? I've never worked before, so we enjoy so much what we do that it doesn't feel like work, and that's key. And when we were discussing this, an editorial that I wrote, I think it was last year, came to mind. It's called "Moving On in Sports Science," and in this editorial, I talk about the reasons why I've moved on in the past, and I consulted with other colleagues who were associate editors of the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance, like me, and I asked them, please send me reasons why you have given up a job in the past, or reasons why you feel that you would advise someone to give up a job and move on, and also reasons to stay put, and to say, well, this is a good reason for me to continue doing this job. And this editorial was particularly successful, and a lot of people emailed me to congratulate me and to tell me how they felt related to what I wrote in that editorial, because they sometimes people felt that those things only happen to them, and that big names or highly successful or people with a very high reputation would not experience those things that I described in the editorial. And they said, "Oh, I'm so happy to hear that other people experience the same, or the same things happen not only to me, who is a beginner in the field of sports science, but also to people with much more experience like yourself." And my main message there was that, keep flexible, open the doors, think about other options if you are unhappy about what you are doing, or if you are not really enjoying it or really convinced that this is what you should be doing. There is always other opportunities. When people say, "Oh, the train only comes through once," I don't agree. I think there are many trains, and you can catch many trains in many different directions.
I'm just thinking about the conversation that we had on the podcast with Maker Bartels, talking about well-being, and she was a sunny disposition, but she was quite straight down the line of people need to do things that make them happy, and then they need to stop doing things that make them
Hmm.
unhappy. And part of that is the environment that you're in. Part of that is the people you're surrounded with. Part of that is the choices and the agency that you have in creating a life well lived. And maybe we need to sometimes stop and pause and reevaluate. So, what were the top reasons? What were the things that people came back to you with and said, "Hmm, I would suggest this is something that has caused me to move
Yeah,
on," or
quite
otherwise?
often it came down to a poor environment, and poor relationships in the work environment. That was, I would say, number one reason to go. And those bad relationships might have to do with jealousy, or it might have to do with being evaluated by people who are usually even less qualified than yourself to evaluate your own work, and say, well, who are you to say that I'm not doing my job properly? Like, what have you done? What is your background? What allows you to judge what I'm doing? Uh, it usually came down to poor relationships, and that
Yeah.
applied both to academia and to a more high performance sport environment, because I discussed both in that editorial.
Mm. Yeah, 9 out of 10, I think it's 9 out of 10 people who leave a job, they do so because of their manager, um, and inversely, the same. 9 out of 10 people stay because of the
Yeah,
people
it's
around them.
it's it's satisfying, when you go
Yeah.
to work and you have enriching discussions every day, and that's the way it was when I worked at the AIS. It was fantastic. Like, you would go out. It didn't have to be an official meeting or an official discussion. You could go out for a jog, or go out for a surf, or go out for a bike ride with your colleagues. And some of the discussions that happened in those situations were so rich, and so many ideas came out of those discussions, that it was a fantastic environment to be working in. We were like constantly coming up with new things. Oh, we should study this. We should do that. We should try that. It was sensational. And it's not only the how to call it, the the facilities of the Australian Institute of Sport. It was the brains at the Australian Institute of Sport, and the characters at the AIS at that time. So it was so good that, it felt like a vacation. We were working hard, but it was so much fun that it never felt like work.
Yeah. Hey, we had David Martin on a few years ago, and being surrounded by people like David, having him on the podcast, I was buzzing. I had to go and do an intensity session just to burn off some energy from that. But I guess it's not just that, is it? I mean, I've got sort of nostalgic views of the early days of the formation of the Olympic Association in Britain, UK sport, and as it was forming, there was a freedom to that was quite palpable. That perhaps before it got too organized, before too many systems, before too many standard operating procedures were put into place, that it was that idea of, oh, that was good. Let's try and impose conformity on
Mhm.
everyone, when actually you need a spark of innovation or difference. You guys go and work on this, or you guys go and work on that, and and actually having the ability to explore. I know it's been a really difficult challenge for a lot of performance teams. Um, and we used to look over at the Australian system and think that's interesting that they are going down much more of a research angle. And we're probably much more focused on transitioning that knowledge into the athletes' world, but we haven't got as much capacity for research. How over the years have you balanced that demand on you acting on information for athletes versus potentially pausing that work and going off and thinking more deeply about a
Mhm.
study and trying to
Yeah,
understand a concept?
that's a very, very good question. I have colleagues who have actually left jobs as soon as the environment or the institution becomes too heavy, and the admin tasks become too cumbersome. So some institutions make the mistake, from my point of view, of starting off as a very agile, very we should do this. Okay, let's do it. Hands on, project done, success, move on to the next one. And then suddenly they see that they are becoming successful, and they say, oh, this is in need of some more organization. And then it becomes bigger and bigger and heavier and more admin. And then instead of becoming a speedboat, they turn into a cruise for thousands of people. And a speedboat can change direction very quickly and turn around and go and do something else and go somewhere else. Whereas one of those cruise ships, they are heavy, and they are difficult to steer, and they are difficult to change direction, and then it's no longer fun. And I have colleagues who have left institutions that were speedboats as soon as they became big cruise ships. And in my case, I am more a doer than I'm a thinker. So I'm not very good at writing down big projects, and I prefer doing things. I want to do this because I think it's going to help the athletes or it's going to help the coaches. Do I have a budget for this? Yes, go ahead, do it. Boom. And I do it. And that's one of the advantages of working as a freelance, because some other times when you are under contract, you need to justify what you do to the management, and then to the upper management, and then to the top management, and then to the top of the top management. And that's something I don't enjoy. That's the main reason why I am not a full professor in university, is because I don't want to have to deal with all the admin and all the project writing, and looking for grants and all of that. I want to get things done. And in my opinion, the way to get things done and the way to help athletes and to help coaches has to be agile, and it has to be easy. Easy in the sense of, if an athlete or a coach wants an answer, they want it immediately. They cannot be waiting for a project to be written, a project to be approved, a project to be developed, and then you might get an answer in 2 years' time. Normally, it's something that you need now. And the only way of doing it now is by doing a doer, by being a doer, rather than
Mm,
depending too much on big cumbersome structures.
okay, so you don't necessarily like that waiting for other people to get back to you. You don't necessarily like those bigger structures and perhaps bureaucratic machinations of systems, but you've just edited a massive book. and and you were the founding father of International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance as the editor. So those are two big examples of what you must have to
Yes,
either love the process or you just set the terms of this is the way I'm going to do it.
exactly,
I
Steve,
presume that's
because
the latter.
I have collaborated for those projects with people who are also doers. And I
Okay.
know a lot of people who have contributed to those books, Endurance Training, Science and Practice, first edition and second edition 4 months ago, would not contribute unless they knew I was a doer. Because a lot of those contributors to the book are people who hate writing a book chapter that is completely up to date with the science, and then they rely on a publisher who is going to take a year and a half or 2 years to get the book published and making it available to the readers. So even in the first edition of the book 11 years ago, I promised the contributors, if you participate in this project, I promise that within 3 months of me receiving the last chapter, the book will be available. And that meant that I had to find the way of making the book available within 3 months. So I had to have everything ready. I needed to have the layout artist. I needed to have the printers. I needed to have a way of distributing the book, so the website ready and everything ready, so that as soon as I received the final chapter, within 3 months, everything was done. And I told them I would do that, and I did that. So 11 years later, when I decided to do the second edition, people knew uh, that that's the way I worked for the first edition. So they were happy to contribute again. New contributors were more than happy to contribute to the new edition. And even some people, when they heard that I was putting together a new edition, they contacted me, oh, could I collaborate in this book? Because I know how good it was in the first edition. So I assume it's going to be very good in this edition too. And I think I could contribute with this and this and that. So some people were actually asking to participate in this. Whereas if I would have taken 2 years to get the paper, the book published, a lot of these collaborators or contributors would have said, no, I'm not interested. Because by the time the book gets to the reader's hands, my chapter is already out of date. Because there is a new literature that has come out over the past year and a half or over the past 2 years. And by the time you publish this, my chapter is no longer good enough. And I can tell you that even 2 days before the book went to print, I was still taking into considerations emails from contributors telling me, "Oh, Inigo, are we still on time to change this and that? Because we have found a new paper that actually is in contradiction to something we wrote in the chapter." And I said, "Yes, no problem. If you do that with a big publisher, there is no way it's going to happen." So when the book went to the printer, there were references that were 2 days old.
I can imagine your reputation goes before you. You know, if someone signs up to work with you, you're editing it, I'd know I'd get a pretty "come on, Steve, get your ass in gear" kind of email if I was a bit behind. You know what? Actually, you wouldn't need to send it. I just know you'd be there, just as a presence. Look, it's a fantastic book. The how many chapters? 33 really compelling chapters by 60 plus 70 odd authors of real note and clout that you have shepherded and galvanized into what looks like an incredible tome, all the way from periodization of endurance training, determinants of performance, pacing, metabolic adaptations to training, genetics, endurance training for team sports. And this is a big question, but what is different between the first book and the second book besides updating the knowledge? Have you felt any shifts in applied practice, fundamental knowledge that are really worth noting and drawing out?
Yes, and I think over the last 11 years there has been plenty of high quality research in endurance training science to justify a new edition. And I could tell you that probably 95% of the book is completely new. A lot of the contributors are the same, but they cover different topics. And those who are the same contributors writing about the same topic, they have completely rewritten their chapters or updated their chapters so much that they look completely different. So I have some new topics, and I have some similar topics, but that are written by different contributors. So the approach is 100% different, and the text is 100% different and updated. And one of the requests that I made to all contributors was, please focus on the research that has been published over the past 10 years. Of course, there are some references that are maybe 20, 30, 40 years old that are absolutely necessary. But if possible, I would like you to focus on those new informations that have become available over the past decade. And all contributors have done a great job about that. And I have also included 4 chapters that I thought were missing in the first edition. That included endurance training in Paralympic sports, the female endurance athlete. So there is a particular chapter dedicated to that. There is another one on immunological aspects of endurance training. And the 4th one that is new, and you mentioned it before, is endurance training for team sports. So those are the new chapters. The other 29 chapters were already there in the first edition, but as I said, they are completely different and completely up to date with the scientific literature.
And like I say, are there anything that as you're reading through, editing, that you had a palpable shift in thinking, this has moved the field on? We're really further advanced now. Can you give me a few examples of topics?
I think in a lot of the chapters you can see a trend towards the importance of individualizing everything in regards to the preparation of elite athletes. So in every chapter you can see that general recipes are no longer valid in the world of elite sports, and there is a need to move towards an individualized approach. And I mentioned also that new chapter about the female endurance athlete, but interestingly, besides that particular chapter, in several other chapters, there are sections in which the female athlete is mentioned. And sometimes in the sense of, oh, we now have sufficient scientific evidence to discuss the female athlete separately, or at least to say, hey, we need additional information on the female athlete. So I think those two aspects are pervasive throughout the book. You can read everywhere the importance of the individualization in the preparation of the athletes, and also this particular focus on the female athlete, because for a very long time we could even say that female athletes have been neglected in the world of sports science.
Yeah. Okay. So the difference between perhaps 20 years ago, where we were just saying, "Hey, look, this is a concept that we've observed in a study." Now we're saying, okay, there's differences in responses or similarities in responses between male and female groups, and we're opening up that conversation beyond the bland, well, not bland, but the human physiology
Mm-hmm.
of one species considered as one, rather than male and female.
Absolutely, and it's logical, and it has to do with the progressive participation of women in sport, the progressive growth of that participation, and also of the level of those females in elite sports, but also the participation of female sports scientists
Yeah.
in the world of sports science research. And also in this sense, I wrote another editorial a few years ago with a colleague from Finland called Sports Science on Women and Women in Sports Science. And in that editorial, we discussed, on the one hand, the need for more research on female athletes, and on the other hand, the need for involving more female sports scientists in the world of sports science as main researchers, as professors, as collaborators, as co-authors, as reviewers, as speakers in conferences, etc., etc., etc. So I think in that sense there has been a progression over the past decade, fortunately, and that needed to be reflected in the book. And I think we did a decent job
Mm.
about getting the information on female sport athletes in the book, and also at involving expert female sports scientists as contributors
Mm.
to the book.
And more power to that. What was the suggestion of your, I presume, female colleague in Finland as to how we can encourage more females to be involved at those different levels?
Well, if off the top of my head, I remember that one of the recommendations was that we should always publish separate results. When we have male and female participants in a study, we should try to provide sufficient information about the male results on the one hand and the female results on the other hand. So in case somebody wants to do a meta-analysis about the female responses or the female adaptations to this or that, they can take out and extract from the data the specific data to female athletes. In addition to that, we should always try to report on the menstrual status of the participants. And there were also recommendations about how to do that. It's not enough to say, oh, this is day 14 of the cycle or day 22 of the cycle. Normally, we are going to need to do, if we want to be precise about it, we are going to need to do some hormonal analysis to make sure that we are describing the day of the cycle appropriately. And then we need to be proactive at the time of involving sports scientists in the world of sports science. And being proactive means, as I said before, if you are writing a paper and you are looking for co-authors, make sure that some of those co-authors are female sports scientists. And if you are organizing a conference, keep in mind that there should be some balance between male speakers and female speakers. And if you have a PhD jury, make sure that you have some female sports scientists or more female sports scientists than you have male sports scientists. So it's about being conscious of the need
Yeah.
to get a more a better balance between males and females in everything that has to do with sports science.
It feels like a very active, almost proactive process that we've got to go through. We've got to be champions of one half of our community.
Yeah, we need to be. I think it's
Yeah,
called
yeah.
positive discrimination. You need to give more opportunities so that they reach a level that is
Mm.
half and half.
Can I just pick up on a point that you
Hopefully.
made there about individualization and that shift that you're feeling? And what's your take or your wisdom on something, a book that is going to be based by researchers and applied scientists, considering the evidence base of probably group studies mostly, but increasingly having a shift towards individualization. Um, this is one thing that I've wrestled with over the years. Just when you're working with an athlete who is an extremophile in their physiology or their psychology or both, and you're trying to take that leap of faith from a fundamental first principles approach to thinking, is this concept likely to work with this person? This person is double the capacity that I'm seeing in these average data points in a study. What's your sense of how we can better individualize, that we can apply science from group cohort based studies?
Mhm. That's an excellent question. And my approach is usually, and this is something I repeat when I present to coaches and when I talk to athletes, is try to put as much evidence base into your training program, because that will give you more opportunities to succeed and get things right more often than you get them wrong. And I'll give you an example of using the science, but then individualizing the approach for a successful outcome. I used one of your papers on high intensity intermittent training in rowers for a club of traditional rowing here in the Basque Country I was
Mm,
collaborating with. And I recommended them to use your high intensity interval training intensities, durations, recoveries. But then, of course, you cannot do exactly the same thing with everyone. You have the science, you have the results, and you personally saw that this approach was successful. So I thought, well, if it was successful for Steve's rowers, there is no reason why it wouldn't be successful for our rowers. So you apply those intensities and those times and those recoveries, but of course you are going to test every individual athlete, and then you are going to say, yes, we are going to be working at whatever 95% of maximal aerobic power, but in your case that represents 324 watts, and in your case it represents 352, and in your case that is 298. So then you have to go there and individualize the approach for every single athlete. Yes, you are using a general recipe for high intensity interval training, but then you go and individualize the actual power output that they need to develop during the training sessions. So that would be a very simple and logical way of applying the scientific evidence, but then individualizing for the athlete. And then maybe one athlete, I remember that you had two, I think you were comparing two different high intensity interval training modes. And we said, well, we don't want half of our rowers to be good and the other half not to be good. So we can't have a, a proper control group that does not do the high intensity interval training. So what we are going to do is half the team is going to do one intensity and one duration and one recovery, and the other half is going to do the other, because we know that both methods are going to work. And instead of saying, oh, you are going to get the goodies and you are not going to get any of this, we said everybody's going to get something that should help their performance, but we are going to compare two methods of doing high intensity interval training. You are going to do this and you are going to do that. And depending on the outcome, you might say mean values when you do this, 4% improvement, mean values when you do this, 3.8% improvement. But maybe some particular athletes in this group did not
Yes.
get as much benefit as the others, and some participants in this other group did not get as much benefit as the others. So you might say, okay, from now on, when we do a phase of high intensity interval training, you are going to switch. And instead of doing this type of training, you are going to be the other type, you are going to be doing the other type of training. And these athletes are going across to the other group and they are going to do the other type of training, because there might be a physiological reason why they respond better to this type of stimulus and why these other athletes might respond better to the other type of stimulus. So that in my view, that could be an example of using the evidence base and then adapting it to the individual athlete.
Love that. Love all of that. I think that the sense in that is really profound. There's just that idea of taking knowledge, ideas, concepts, paradigms as a start point, and trying it, implementing it, or maybe it's probably just more of a tidying up of someone's program. It might not necessarily be fundamental changes, but then testing and learning. We're going to apply additional measurements under the auspices of why guess when we can know. we rather than just this is our best foot forward, let's give it a go. Why not understand whether it's actually working for you or not?
That has always been my approach as a coach and also as a sports scientist, making recommendations to coaches. You know, if I see a paper that publishes some solid results from an intervention, and I know that the authors are good people, that they know what they are doing, and I can't believe the methods and I can't believe the results, I assume that if this works for that group and I have a similar group, it should work for my group. So we're going to try this. And it has been my approach when I was coaching elite triathletes for 13 years. Hey, I went to a conference and somebody presented about this, and I think it's something that we can get some benefit from. Let's try it. So we would try it, and then we would tweak it and maybe manipulate it until we found the right approach for that particular athlete that I was working with. Or maybe I could try an approach and tell the coach, if I wasn't the coach, if I'm just an advisor or the physiologist for a group, I might say, I think we should try this. And maybe the coach might say, yeah, that sounds good, but instead of doing this, I would maybe change it to that for this reason, and this reason. And then I might say, yeah, that sounds good. Let's go for it. And that's something I'm doing at the moment with some elite Japanese rowers. You know, I'm in permanent contact with the head coach, and I make suggestions. I think this is the way we should be going. And the coach, because of his extensive knowledge of elite rowing, he comes back to me and says, that sounds like a good idea, but I think it might be better if we do a little bit less of that and a little bit more of this, etc., etc. But the foundation or the basis of the approach is scientific evidence, and then individualization,
Yeah.
which we make the link with the evolution of the book we were talking about a few minutes ago.
Yeah, there's a fascinating difference you make there in terms of if you're the coach. If you're the coach and you're the author, then you're directing things. You're making those decisions as you go. You're balancing the risk and the practical implications based upon your tacit knowledge, that new idea. But if you're an advisor, you're suggesting an idea, and the interaction between you and the coach is some of the translation of that idea where it's adapting. And I presume the modification of your suggestion back to you is a little bit of a check for you to think, is the physiological effect still going to be happening? Is it still going to, if you change it enough, is it still going
Yeah,
to get that change? Yeah.
exactly. But I would add to that when I was acting as a coach, I would have the same type of discussion with the athletes, because my feeling was that we were learning together. So now, as an advisor or as a sports physiologist, I might go to the coach and I might say, we should do this. What's the feedback? And then we discuss that together, and then he applies that to the athletes. When I was the coach, I was also the physiologist, because I cannot not be a physiologist, even if I am acting as a coach. And in this case, the physiologist in me would say, as a coach, I think we should be doing this. And then instead of saying we are doing this, I would discuss this possibility with the athletes and say, listen, as a physiologist, I think we should be doing this. I am your coach. I'm going to prescribe this. What do you think? And then they would maybe try exactly what I suggested, but then there would be some feedback from them. And they would say, I think whatever, the intensity is too high, or the duration is too short, or my heart rate did not respond the way you thought it was going to respond, so we should modify this or that. So every time, yeah, I might make a suggestion or make a call, but there is always someone to discuss it with. If you are the coach, with the athletes; if you are the physiologist, with the coach.
Yeah.
Because we don't know
No.
everything, and and there is always something to learn from the people you are working with.
Yeah, and it's a very mature but contemporary view of that coach athlete relationship, where there's a partnership, that there's an engagement that's to and fro, and requires the athlete to have a deeper understanding than perhaps we expected a couple of decades ago when we first started out. That it was quite transactional. It felt a lot more like that. But if you've got that nuance and that 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 contextual interpretation, they know how it feels. They think about their training a lot. If you can tap into that as a source of intelligence, that's huge for your ability to prescribe and apply your concepts.
Yeah, and depending on the relationship that you have developed with the coach, uh, even as a sports scientist, you might be able to discuss things with the athletes themselves.
Yeah.
I know coaches who said, no, all the information comes through me, and I'm the one talking to the athletes. But I've worked with coaches, and in particular the swimming coach that I've worked with for over 10 years, Fred Vernieu, who would say, I don't want any of that information to be lost in translation. So you go and talk to the athletes, you explain that to them, because you are going to explain better than me. So some coaches trust the sports scientist, might be the physiologist or the biomechanist or the nutritionist, to go and talk to the athletes directly, whereas other coaches prefer to be the filter through which the information is transferred to the athletes.
Yeah.
But in both cases, I think it's important to have a solid evidence base and then to discuss the possibilities of that evidence base and the application of those results or findings to the real world of sports.
That gives me a bit of an opportunity to pivot and to ask you a little bit more about some of your specialisms around tapering and peaking. And I say that I obviously looking through your research publications recently and beyond. It's quite it's an extensive but a eclectic mix of different topics over the years that you've explored, and I've no doubt people have brought you on board to add value as a thinker and a coach as much as a specialist in certain areas. But I mean, this endurance training book, Endurance Training Science and Practice, I'm scrolling down looking for the tapering section, and you're not on there. You moved yourself off into training cessation. So I suppose broadly, you've got a hot topic of easing of training workload. um, just taking the foot off the gas a little bit. Is tapering and peaking still a focus for your research?
Yes, it is big time. I'm still interested in that. I'm still doing lectures about that. I'm still looking into the research that other people do about that. But the main reason why I decided not to do the chapter on tapering myself is that I had been writing so much. 11 years ago, when I published the first edition of Endurance Training Science and Practice, I had been doing so much writing about tapering and peaking that it was very difficult for me to not write the same thing again. And I didn't want to write the same thing again. I wanted the book to have something new, something that had not been published before. And I couldn't see how I could do that if I wrote the chapter myself. So instead of that, I decided to contact someone else who had done some extensive research about tapering, Patrick Neary from Regina University in Canada. And I preferred him to write the chapter, and he could cite my own work if he wanted to, and he did. But I thought it was a good way of seeing somebody else's views in print inside the book. And for the new edition, my approach was to first contact the same authors from the first edition, and if they were willing to contribute again, go ahead with them, and alternatively give the opportunity to someone else. And in this case, Patrick felt that he wanted to contribute that chapter again, but he found some of his young students to collaborate with him to write that chapter.
Mm.
That's the main reason.
That's very noble.
Detraining has been
Yeah.
also one of my interests for a long time, and only recently we have published two very interesting papers about the minimal training dose to retain training adaptations with Barry Spearing and some other colleagues from the US, and another paper about bed rest, also with Barry Spearing and Jonathan Wickley from Australia, which are two topics that are very closely related with training cessation, detraining, and how to retain training-induced adaptations at times during which, for whatever reason, you cannot train as much as you would like or as much as you should, or maybe you are injured or you go on vacation or whatever. And those topics, I think, are very, very relevant, somehow related with tapering as well, but mostly related with the overall preparation of the athletes.
And so before we get into the specifics of the topic, do you find that when you're working with athletes and coaches and teams, do you find that there's a greater resistance, sensitivity, maybe reluctance to change some of the tapering and competition lead-in strategies, perhaps compared to, say, training zones, which you might set, October, November. This is crunch time. This is just before competition. What's your take on that? What's your feeling on the ground when people open that conversation up a little bit, or if you're pushing the door on that one, what's the response you get?
One of the issues with tapering is that it's the final phase of a
Yeah,
periodized approach to performance. So you cannot afford to make mistakes, because then there is a counter performance coming. That's for sure. You don't have time to correct the path and make it good. And when you tell coaches and athletes, let's have a look at the scientific evidence, and what I can guarantee is that your chances of getting it right are going to improve. That's all I can promise to coaches. If we look at the scientific evidence, you have more possibilities of getting it right, and you have more possibilities of reaching the competition with a very, very high performance potential. That doesn't mean a very, very high performance. It means performance potential. Because sometimes an athlete might have a counter performance and we immediately blame it on the taper. Oh, we didn't do the taper right. Oh, the tapering strategy was not correct. And that's not necessarily the case. Maybe the performance potential was there, but other factors were responsible of a counter performance. Maybe the athlete was not able to cope with the pressure, or maybe some technical issue precluded a good performance in competition. But the potential was there. So we can promise, and I'm convinced about what I'm saying, I think we can promise an optimum performance potential with the right tapering strategy based on the scientific evidence, but we cannot promise an optimal performance. Only the
yeah.
potential, because of
There,
course the performance depends on the fitness, and depends on the psychological state of the athlete, depends on the confidence, depends on the rivals, and all of that is going to determine the performance outcome.
yeah,
But the best we can do is make sure that the athlete gets to the start line in the best possible fitness state. And that I think we can do with the knowledge that we have about tapering and picking.
yeah. And with that in mind, then, um, what are the main mistakes that you encounter? And I've this is deliberately generic in terms of the event demands and the different standard of athletes that people might encounter. But are you able to step back and think there are a couple of trends that seem to come up? I'm asking this question because I think I might know what you might say.
Yeah. Well, for me, the first mistake would be under resting.
Yeah,
Many coaches and many athletes themselves are afraid of losing adaptation, so they are afraid of cutting down on the work. So they might think, oh no, I'm not training enough, I need to train more. I'm used to training so many hours or so many kilometers or whatever, and now you're asking me to reduce by too much. So they end up not reducing the training load sufficiently to dissipate all that accumulated fatigue and allow for a proper supercompensation phenomenon to occur, which is the phenomenon that is going to justify a fitness peak. So under resting would be the common mistake number one. And the common mistake number two is panicking and changing direction during the taper because of how an athlete feels on a given training session during the taper. So overreacting to how an athlete feels. And the reality is that during the taper, like during the entire season, we all have good days and bad days. And athletes might have good days and bad days 4 months away from competition and also 4 days away from competition. But if we have a plan and if we know what we are doing, we should trust that plan. And we should not overreact because 4 days from competition, the athlete says, oh, I feel like crap. We all have a bad day. So maybe the next day, that same athlete is going to be flying in training and feeling fantastic. And that's one of the things that Bob Bowman, the coach of Michael Phelps, among many other super swimmers, writes in my very first book, which is called Tapering and Peaking for Optimal Performance. Avoid overreacting based on how an athlete feels on a particular day. If you have a plan, trust the plan. Because that same athlete might be feeling completely differently the next day. So do not overreact if you know what you are doing and why you are doing it. Those two would be my key recommendations. Don't be afraid of taking away a lot of work, because tapering doesn't mean, oh, go home and don't do anything. During the taper, you do a lot of work and you do a lot of high intensity work.
Yeah.
So it's much more possible to under rest than to over rest if you are doing the taper right. And trust the process, particularly if your approach to the taper has a scientific basis.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that. I wasn't anticipating the panicking part as much, but I think the detaching the association in athletes' minds of hard work gives improved physiological fitness equals results. Detaching from that, but also detaching from feeling like you're training hard. That sense of I've got energy. I don't know what to do with myself, or I don't feel like I'm doing enough. And perhaps infected by the fact that they've got a little bit more time to themselves. So they're now starting to think, what am I going to do with this time? And the brain starts thinking, I'm not training enough. That's possibly another one. I think I've probably got a few other observations I'd love to get your thoughts on. One is about not practicing the taper enough. So it's almost like this is the thing that we observe right at the end, when actually this is so important, it probably warrants rehearsal or some familiarity earlier in the season. And the other one is around peaking afterwards. I see athletes peaking after the big competitions too commonly.
The reason for that peaking after the competition, in my opinion, there might be two different reasons. One is the athlete came to the major event under rested, and then they went home frustrated. They didn't train for a few days. They got that recovery that they should have gotten before, and then they have this performance peak afterwards, like 1 week or 10 days after the main event. The second possibility is that the athletes were overwhelmed by the responsibility, by the pressure of competition. And although the performance potential was there, and I come back to that concept of performance potential, but that potential was not realized on the big stage. And therefore, when they go to a lesser competition and there is not so much pressure and they have already missed the big event, they can do the performance that they should have done a few days before, because there is no longer so much pressure and so much psychological stress.
So, before you comment on the not practicing enough, can I ask you about another theory that I have, completely unfounded, but I guess a hunch, is that, and we're delving into some of the specifics of the components of tapering and peaking now, but I wonder whether not easing the training off enough is quite common, but then the actual competition itself serves as an intensity stimulus from which there is adaptation, which it's almost like a big bang focused intensity session that you might manufacture in training, but because people aren't tapering well enough, the competition, perhaps an Olympic final, serves as that stimulus from which they actually peak afterwards. What do you think about that idea?
Um, it might be a possibility depending on the event, and in fact, that comment comes in relation with something that I usually discuss in my presentations about tapering, because most athletes don't compete once. Most athletes have to do the heats and then the semis and then the final, or in the case of swimming, they have to swim the 100 and then the 200 butterfly, or or somebody might run whatever 5K and then they have to run 10K also. So normally you don't compete only once. And a question that I usually get is, oh, should I plan my taper for the first day of the Olympics, or should I plan my taper for the seventh day of the Olympics when I'm supposed to be swimming the final? And according to the scientific evidence that we have, and some computer simulations that we have done, if you increase the training load towards the end of the taper when the athlete is fresh, and then they can get additional adaptation from the extra training that they do, they might get additional benefits. They might get a little bit fitter, and therefore they might get a better performance. And competing repeatedly might be equivalent to increasing the training load in those final days of the taper. And competition itself is the most specific form of training. And that extra stimulus, that extra fitness might come from the competition itself. In some cases, you can take advantage of that to perform at your very best in the final, because you have already done the heats and the quarterfinals and the semis, and then you pick at the final. Or in an unfortunate situation, the final itself might be the stimulus that you needed before and that you are taking advantage of in the post Olympic lesser competition that you are using as an example. So you miss your final in the Olympics, but that stimulus gives you the extra fitness, and then you go to a World Cup somewhere, and that's where you reach your fitness and performance peak. But if you plan it properly, you should be able to take advantage of the pre-final qualification events, if you want to call them like that, to actually reach the fitness peak at the right time.
Yeah. Okay. And so buried in that response there was a nugget around actually elevating the training slightly, whether that's volume or intensity or both, and benefiting from that training at a disproportionate level because you're maybe fresher. So it feels like you can probably attack or tuck into those training sessions at a greater level. Is that what you're?
Yeah, that's something that I tried with triathletes that I coached, in particular two brothers that were initially in the Olympic distance, and then they moved on to the Ironman distance. And I usually present this too. one year they both prepared for Ironman Austria, and the tapering approach was completely different for the two brothers. One of them liked to feel really, really fresh on competition day, so we reduced the training load progressively until the very last day before competition. Whereas the other brother preferred to be fresh, but if he was too fresh or if he reduced too much until the last day, then suddenly having to compete for 8 hours was like, oh, what? My body is not responding. You are asking something that I'm not used to doing in training because I have been reducing my training load a lot beforehand. So we had two different approaches for the two brothers, and they finished second and third in this Ironman event with very good performances, with two completely different approaches. And those approaches were based on listening to them, my communication with them, and them telling me, oh, I don't like reducing until the very last day. Okay, let's try a 2-phase taper. Or telling me, I don't like to increasing the load before the race. I like to reduce until the very last day and feel completely rested, completely recovered. So I would take on board the perceptions of the athletes and manipulate the taper based on that. And then after I had tried that from a practical point of view with the athletes, we did some computer simulations based on the data from elite swimmers, and the computer simulations somehow validated the approach of increasing the load slightly towards the end of the taper, because that could produce additional adaptation. Because as the athletes recover, they also recover, as they dissipate fatigue, they also recover their ability to adapt and their tolerance to training. And if they recover that ability to adapt and that training tolerance, they can produce higher quality training when they are fresh. And that might induce additional adaptation.
Yeah, fascinating. They weren't twins, were they?
No, they weren't twins.
Ah, what a shame. and so look, we've delved into that quite specifically, but from a just for anyone who's not necessarily as familiar about tapering and peaking that's listening, what are the major factors that need to be considered? And are there any principles that are universally accepted that you would share? I know this is contextual and it depends, but if you've got some general advice there.
There is some general advice that is extracted from the meta-analysis that we have done and the practical experience that I have and my colleagues I've been working with have. And the principles include: you need to decrease the training load because you need to dissipate fatigue so that your fitness level can appear and reach a supercompensation. But of course, there are different methods of reducing the training load. You could reduce training volume or training frequency or training intensity. And according to the research, training intensity is key to retain training-induced adaptations. So during the taper, you need to reduce the training load, but don't do it reducing the training intensity. Training frequency in highly trained athletes should not be reduced too much, particularly when the sport is very depending on feel and technique. So it might be better to go to training and do a little and maintain that feel and that technique than to stay at home and don't do anything. So for highly trained athletes, we shouldn't rely too much on reducing training frequency to reduce the training load. Therefore, our only option left is to manipulate training volume. And according to the literature, the vast majority of athletes are going to benefit from a training volume reduction of around 40 to 60% comparing to the training volume that is usually performed in the pre-taper mesocycle. So general principles: maintain intensity, do not reduce frequency, at least not too much, reduce training volume by about 40 to 60%. And then we have the duration of tapering. How long before the main competition we are going to start reducing the training load. And tapers lasting from 1 week to 4 weeks can work. But the main recommendation for the big majority of athletes, if you don't know exactly where to start, my recommendation and our recommendation is usually go for a 2-week taper, because that's the duration that is going to benefit most athletes. And that has been seen both in individual sports and also in team sports. The majority of athletes are going to optimize their adaptations with a taper that usually lasts 2 weeks. Of course, we can then individualize, as we have said before. And some athletes might benefit from a somewhat longer taper, and some athletes might need a slightly shorter taper. And that's where the trial and error approach come into place.
And that sense of how that training volume is reduced, your previous meta-analyses, fast exponential, slow exponential reduction, or a step, sudden sort of reduction.
Yeah.
Have you got any further thoughts on how that the data is playing out now?
Normally, for the majority of athletes, an exponential reduction would be the preferred approach. So you suddenly reduce the training load, and then you tend to maintain at that lower value for a few more days, because that way the athlete recovers relatively quickly. They recover that ability to adapt and dissipate that fatigue, and they might get more benefit from the training that is actually done during the taper.
And how do you advise sports differently based upon the event demand? You know, if we just take a sort of a gross endurance versus sprint power, are there principles that again you can differentiate the advice?
Based on the scientific evidence, I would say no.
Really?
I wouldn't say it depends on whether you are a sprinter or whether you are a middle distance athlete or a long distance athlete. In my opinion, and based on the scientific literature, I would say that within the sprinter world, you have athletes with a particular profile of adaptation and disadaptation that requires a particular type of taper. And within that same event duration, or the case of sprinting, you have athletes with a completely different individual profile of adaptation and disadaptation. So it depends much more on the individual profile of adaptation and disadaptation than it does on the particularities of the event.
Okay.
So you might have similar athletes and similar profiles of adaptation and disadaptations within sprinting and endurance, and a completely different profile within sprinting and endurance. And that is what will determine your approach to the taper rather than the event itself.
And maybe this comes back to the idea of practicing, and if you're advising a team, do you have a set of measurements that you would be recommending? I guess it's an obvious thing if you're working with a cycling team that you'd be looking at power outputs that are being produced, or but are there any additional measurements that are giving you good clues that adaptation is occurring?
Yes, of course it depends on what means you have to measure and evaluate what's going on. For example, we know that resting cortisol should be decreasing throughout the taper. We know that peak lactate production should be increasing during the taper. But there are some other markers like the heart rate to RPE ratio it's a good indication of whether the athletes are going to adapt properly or not to the taper. And then there is the stopwatch,
Yeah.
there is a stopwatch.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, I always say that communication is key between the athletes and the coaches all the time, but even more so during the taper.
Mm.
So if there is a good working relationship between the athletes and the coaches, and and a particular athlete keeps saying, uh, "I haven't recovered enough. I haven't recovered enough," or "I think I need a little bit more training." In that case, I am always in favor of listening to the athlete, and without drastic changes in the training program, because of what I said before of believe in the program. Everyone can feel good or bad on a particular day, but we can make little changes based on communication with the athlete and how they feel.
Mm. Yeah. Interesting. It springs to mind a fairly loose case study that I worked through working with a javelin thrower. And she came to me and knocked on the door and said, "Look, I've been advised to be doing different types of resistance based work prior to big competition." And she said, I just don't really want to. I want to stick with what I currently do. And I like it because when I've tried the alternative of classic weightlifting, power cleans, and so on, that fast, rapid movement that you would associate with powerful javelin performance, she said, it makes sense, but I just don't feel it. When I do what I normally do, which was circuit training, which doesn't necessarily sort of connect with the same speed of movement. But she said, I feel like I have muscle tone, and that's important. And so we spent some time looking at the hormonal responses that she was producing under the different conditions: heavy lifting, fast lifting, circuit training versus some sprints, for example. And lo and behold, circuit training had highest testosterone, growth hormone responses, which would make sense for her that
Mhm.
that seemed to fit. But rather than sort of a big battery of tests of what's working for you, it was responding to what she was
Felt.
identifying, and
Yeah.
us starting to look to see whether there was any backing for her observations.
Mhm. And of course that would boost her confidence.
Yeah, yeah. It certainly ratified that approach that was working for her. She was getting a response that was supporting her subjective feelings. Yeah.
Mhm. And there is an interesting paper that came out last year indicating uh, it looked into the psychological aspects of tapering. It's a review
Right.
paper. And interestingly, it mentioned that the taper might be a particularly stressful period because of the upcoming competition, etc. But not only for athletes, it
Yeah.
is particularly stressful for coaches. And therefore, coaches should be the image of confidence during the taper. Even if they don't know exactly what they are doing and why they are doing it, they should look like they know what and why and why they are doing it, because that confidence is going to be transmitted to the athletes.
Yeah. That the confidence that you're bluffing well enough. I mean, I remember being asked the day before an Olympic final. This was my first Olympic Games in Sydney, and the coach tapped me on the shoulder and said, "I'm thinking about changing the warm up. What do you think?" And I was 26 years old, and I was craving being asked my opinion. I just said no, no. Stick with what you've got. Let's talk about it afterwards. And I'm so relieved that we did, because we ended up doing a really interesting project with that crew. Um, but that's the very essence of over panicking that you mentioned
Hmm.
in the taper. I'm thinking of changing the warm up because I've seen the competitors do it, or I've
I
seen with some of our other, they're not quite responding. Move away from the plan because of panic rather than sense and objectives. Yeah.
Not a
Very
good
good.
move. And good recommendation from 26-year-old Steve.
Yeah. Mainly because I didn't know what we would change it to, but that's another factor. Hey, look, can I ask you a couple of questions, Inigo? And I could spend all day talking to you, but what do you think needs to be done for the future benefit of the profession of applied performance scientists?
That's a big question to finish off.
I'm sure you've got some ideas.
Yes, I think we need to think in terms of the benefit to the end user. And in my opinion, in sports science, not in exercise science, which is more related to academia, but in sports science, the end users are athletes and coaches. So we need to move away from doing the research for ourselves. As researchers, we need to focus more on doing the research to provide valuable information and valuable answers to coaches and athletes. So don't do the research to get a paper. Do the research to improve the performance of athletes or to help the coaches improve their methods to then go and improve the performance of athletes. And that's something that was very, very clear in the early Australian Institute of Sport. And when I was working there, the big question was, is this going to help us win medals? If it is, go ahead and do the research. If you ask yourself, am I doing this research for myself, for my publication record, to have a really cool paper with super champions? And the answer is yes, don't do it. The answer has to be, I am doing it for the athletes, I am doing it for the coaches. And if you do the research and you are actually helping the coaches and the athletes win medals, maybe you should not be publishing it yet. You need to take advantage of that knowledge to win some medals. And then when you are one step ahead, then you publish what you did before.
Yeah. Good. I mean, I like the idea of publishing data straight away.
Me too.
Because
Me too. But when you are working in a high performance environment and you get paid to win medals, you need to take advantage of that performance edge if you do have that performance edge.
Yeah, you know what? I think a different way, and I'm not. I know other people think differently to me. If you publish it, you've then got to move on to the next thing.
Yeah,
You've then got to
it
search,
forces you
and
to be one
it
step ahead.
forces, yeah. If you just rest on your laurels and
Yeah.
sit on that. And the other thing is that I don't think it's the rate limiting factor in making performance happen. I think the rate limiting factor is what we started the conversation about is having good communication, good relationships with coaches. I remember David Pine asking me at ACSM one year when I published some warm-up data enhancing 800-meter performance by 1%, and he said, "Why are you publishing all this? This is just fresh data." And I said, "You go and have the conversation with the coaches. You go and get them to change their warm-up. This has taken me 10 years to get this across the line with the coaches, to convince them of this." And then I saw him 5 years later and I said, "Are you having those conversations yet?" And he said, "Nah, it's a tricky one, isn't it?"
and publications come out maybe 2 years later anyway.
Yeah.
But sometimes, if you are really ahead, it might be worth keeping it to yourself for a little while and then publishing. And I know some institutions force an embargo on their sports scientists of 4 to 5 years.
Yeah, I had the same for I think it was my first PhD study. I had to remove the average data. and the standard deviation. So it just had relationships, and it just didn't have quite enough information. But I was forced to do that by the
And
federation.
I can understand both
Yeah,
approaches. The academic approach of releasing good, fresh data as soon as possible, and the more performance-oriented approach of saying, wait a minute. When we win the medals, then we can publish it.
yeah. Inigo, loved it. Loved the conversation. Thank you so much for spending the time to talk to me today. The two sort of statements that you've made as we've been talking this through, that idea of the scientific evidence shows us this. That's a bedrock of your work and outstanding achievements in this area. But the sensitivities that you show in being able to listen to the athletes and tune that to how they need to perform and how they need to prepare, that shows the very essence of scientifically informed but applied in practice. I've loved just hearing you talk through your processes.
Thank you, Steve. That has always been my approach.